Hello, my name is Conrad Spoke, and I'd like to talk to you about racist and sexist hiring practices at Oregon Shakespeare Festival in Ashland, Oregon. This claim probably sounds utterly insane to you, so please give me a few minutes to make my case. I and another person, Kent Richmond, were excluded from a translation project called Play On, specifically because we are white males. Oregon Shakespeare accomplished this by using a formula designed to mathematically minimize the inclusion of white males. At the time that the planned project was announced, in September 2015, Kent Richmond and myself were absolutely more qualified than anyone else on earth to be a part of the Play On translation project. We were excluded because we are white and male. This video is addressed to every member of the 2018 session of the Oregon State Legislature because I've exhausted all other avenues for justice. Even if you choose to do nothing, at least it will be on the record that Oregon taxpayer funds are going to a large arts organization which is blatantly violating civil rights laws. Explaining this mess will take some time because the arts project in question is fairly arcane. It's all about doing modern English translations of Shakespeare's plays, using a constrained set of rules in order to make Shakespeare easier to understand. First, I'll show you that Oregon Shakespeare has openly advertised their discriminatory hiring scheme from the beginning. In fact, they brag about their bigotry constantly, as though it's perfectly normal and acceptable. Next, I'll show you how their discrimination is in direct violation of their agreement with Oregon Cultural Trust. That agreement encompasses federal and state civil rights statutes. Using graphics, I will demonstrate the mathematical formula by which we were excluded. I'm going to have to convince you that my complaint is valid, and that will involve giving an overview of the translation work that I and Mr. Richmond have already accomplished, along with an explanation of how this translation style works. I'll show that our professional experience clearly predated the Play On project, that our work outclasses that of anyone else chosen for the project, and that the improvised excuses given for our exclusion are bogus. I will argue that the exclusionary tactics of OSF are illogical, anachronistic, and completely at odds with artistic progress. I want you to understand that the racist and sexist ideology at work inside Oregon Shakespeare is illegal and socially corrosive, and I want you to know exactly who's responsible. This will take some time, but I hope you'll be patient because my particular case relates to a much larger cancer which is spread throughout academia, the arts, and political discourse. Let's start with the announcement of the Play On project in 2015 so you can see what this is all about. September 29, 2015. The Oregon Shakespeare Festival announced today the launch of a 39-play, 3-year commissioning project, Play On, 36 Playwrights Translate Shakespeare, supported by a generous grant from the HITS Foundation. I should say that this foundation is a creation of software entrepreneur Dave Hitz, and the grant now totals over $4 million. It goes on, the project is led by Louis Morgan Douthit, OSF's Director of Literary Development and Dramaturgy. Play On has engaged many of the nation's leading playwrights, dramaturges, theater professionals, expert advisors, and emerging voices in the field. Play On will provide translated texts in contemporary modern English as performable companion pieces for Shakespeare's original texts, in the hope that they will be published, read, and adapted for stage and used as teaching tools. Further down, they give criteria for the project. Try to remember some of this because it relates to the corruption at work here. First, do no harm. There is language that will not need translating and some that does. Each team is being asked to examine the play line by line and translate to contemporary modern English those lines that need translating. There is to be no cutting or editing of scenes, and playwrights may not add their personal politics. Second, put the same kind of pressure on the language as Shakespeare put on his. This means the playwright must consider the meter, rhyme, rhythm, metaphor, rhetoric, character, action, and theme of the original. These translations are not adaptations. Setting, time period, and references will remain unchanged. Here's the point where this goes from being an arts project to an illegal exercise in social engineering. By commissioning diverse playwrights, more than 50% women, and more than 50% writers of color, OSF will bring fresh voices and perspectives to the work of translation. More than 50% women and more than 50% writers of color. That is illegal, immoral, and just plain stupid. If you're an honest legislator who understands the law and the basic theory of fair play, this should make your skin crawl. The phrase more than 50% women actually means Oregon Shakespeare Festival has a goal of keeping the participation of men at or below 49%. And the phrase more than 50% writers of color actually means Oregon Shakespeare Festival has a goal of keeping the participation of white people at or below 49%. In a democracy, that's obscene. How can anybody fail to see the raw bigotry at work here? You can't hire people with explicit race and sex quotas if you want to call yourself a civilized organization. And you certainly can't have exclusionary race and sex quotas if you want to receive funds from the taxpayers of Oregon. Here's the current OSF corporate and foundation donors page, which lists their numerous government resources. City of Ashland, National Endowment for the Arts, Oregon Arts Commission, Oregon Cultural Trust, Oregon Humanities. Now, here's an email I received last year from Oregon Cultural Trust after I requested their help. Please hit pause on this and take a couple of minutes to read this closely. And by the way, I can't file a complaint with the Bureau of Labor and Industries because their one-year window has expired. Ms. Schreiner, who has the title Trust Manager, makes it clear in this email that recipients must obey civil rights laws. Quote, all grant recipients of the Oregon Cultural Trust agree to the following. In carrying out its responsibilities under this grant, the recipient shall not deny benefits to or discriminate against any person on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, national origin, sex, disability, or sexual preference, and shall comply with all requirements of federal and state civil rights statutes, rules, and regulations, including, and here's the two which I believe pertain to my case, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. I've prepared a graphic to make it perfectly clear how Oregon Shakespeare violated these laws and its agreement with Oregon Cultural Trust. The language used by OSF, more than 50% this and more than 50% that, seems to be wonderfully inclusive, generous, and positive. But it's not. It's a carefully crafted formula, the sole purpose of which is to exclude certain people. It's the Oregon Exclusion Formula, and here's how it works. We need 36 translators for the Play-On project. First, we want to ensure that more than half are writers of color, non-whites. 36 times 1/2 is 18, but we want more than half, so let's bump that up to 19 non-whites and put them on this grid. It looks like we have 12 males, but only 7 females. We wanted more than half our translators to be women, at least 19, so if we do the math, it looks like we need to choose 12 more women. And here they are. Now that we have over 50% writers of color and over 50% women, how many seats are available to white males? 5. If you go back to the Play-On pages and check out the bios of those white males, you'll discover that they're all theater people, friends of Oregon Shakespeare Festival. At least one is a major OSF employee. None of those 5 white males are more qualified than myself or Mr. Richmond, and neither is anyone else who was chosen. For years, this formula has been fully endorsed and approved by Oregon Cultural Trust, and apparently it's escaped notice of the Oregon State Legislature. The question is, why? Why do they think they have a need to do this? What's the rationale for artificially loading the system with women and people of color? Does this organization have a history of control by a white male patriarchy, which deliberately minimizes the participation of women and non-whites? Is this white male domination problem within Oregon Shakespeare Festival so pernicious and so pressing that it requires an urgent solution, such as this illegal exclusion formula? No, of course not. If you've been to the theater lately, you know that it's one of the most open and non-exclusive work environments to be found. For at least the last 50 years, America's theaters have been absolutely and completely open to anyone who wants to participate. These days, there's nothing particularly groundbreaking about using an all-black cast for Cat on a Hot Tin Roof or All My Sons. Casting is so diverse and varied on the Shakespearean stage that we barely notice. It's been understood literally for generations now that so-called mixed race or mixed gender casting is simply not a problem with Shakespeare. In ancient Verona, the Montagues can be Asian and the Capulets can be black. Women routinely play male roles with their hair pulled up under a cap. A woman can perform a male role as a female character. No one is terribly surprised, and certainly not offended or outraged, by a female Prospero or a Queen Lear. It's been over 50 years since Laurence Olivier played Othello in blackface, and we're never going to see blackface again because there are now countless outstanding black actors to take on the role, which frankly was not the case in 1964. This is not the America of 1964. Even if Oregon Shakespeare Festival were a private enterprise receiving no public funding, there would be no way to logically and morally justify their exclusion formula, because there is no white supremacy phenomenon or subjugation of women in America's theaters, and that includes Oregon Shakespeare Festival. There are few workplaces in America more thoroughly egalitarian and democratized than its public theaters. Now, we can't say the same for politics. Most of you in the Oregon Legislature are white men, but that's because of money, not racism. Legislative bodies in America are occupied primarily by the very wealthy, and in a democracy, that's a real problem we need to work on. Having said that, I'm confident that each and every one of you white males are perfectly able to represent the interests of every resident of the state of Oregon. I'm also talking to women in the legislature and members of various minority groups, and I'm confident that you are willing and able to represent the interests of 2 white males, Kent Richmond and myself. Now I'd like to spend a few minutes convincing you that the 2 of us actually are competent, experienced translators. After all, if we're just a couple of whining nut jobs, my complaint doesn't carry nearly as much weight. You might have gotten the impression that I know Kent Richmond personally, but I don't. I greatly admire the translation work he's done and consider him a professional colleague, but actually I've only had a few email exchanges with him. I'm speaking on his behalf because he's a fellow professional, and we're both identical victims of the same crime. This right here is Mr. Richmond's modern English translation of Romeo and Juliet. A verse translation, copyright 2004. On the back, he outlines the key elements of his translation methodology, and I'd like to read it to you. And as I do, keep in mind the criteria that we went over before from the Play On announcement page that I read from earlier. This translation maintains Shakespeare's verse structure, not a prose paraphrase. Complete, no lines deleted or simplified. Captures the original's tone, complexity, and poetry. Preserves the work's literary integrity. Reveals subtlety and richness without notes or glosses. Ready for serious, faithful stage performance. Mr. Richmond developed this translation philosophy more than a decade before the announcement of the plan project, more than a decade before they mandated nearly identical criteria. Richmond spent several decades teaching in California, then embarked on his passion project of verse translation in about 2001. So far he's published this and 7 others under the trademark Enjoy Shakespeare. You can buy these as paperbacks and as Kindle books through Amazon. Here's his Kindle of Hamlet. Copyright 2012. It's terrific. It's a very well-designed Kindle book, and it makes for a very smooth, pleasant reading experience. In late 2009, I embarked on the same passion project and did so without any knowledge of Mr. Richmond's work. I had long assumed that Shakespeare's language is so hard to comprehend and often utterly incomprehensible due to about 10% of the words being foreign to modern ears. So I gathered some resources and started translating Macbeth. I just did it because I felt like it. And I worked on it as an increasingly serious hobby. About 3 years later, I had finished something I call a 10% translation. I now sell my translations of Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet in PDF format at a marketing website called teacherspayteachers.com. As you can see, this is a complete book with introductory material. The original text is on the left and my translation is on the right. There's tons of extra material, but it's placed at the back so that it doesn't slow down reading. I tried to make this as interesting as possible for the general reader or for the classroom. The linking works fine on your iPad, and it's scaled exactly like a paperback book. My criteria and methodology ended up being quite similar to Mr. Richmond's, even though it was a couple of years before I eventually came across his work. We both had the same intuition that audiences would reject a translation which ceased to sound Shakespearean, and so we both hit on a similar strategy of minimal alteration to the text. Let me show you what this looks like. Here's a passage from Macbeth as translated by each of us. This is Act 2, Scene 3, lines 85 to 90. Macbeth is pretending to be distraught by the king's murder, even though he himself killed the king only hours prior. You might want to stop the video and take a minute to see how this works. Notice the line, "All is but toys." The word toys meant something completely different 400 years ago, and Mr. Richmond and myself translate this in 2 slightly different ways. I use games while he uses trifles. His word has 2 syllables, so he compensates by changing renown to fame. These kinds of subtle choices and adjustments are found throughout all our translations. If you read our translations aloud, you find that they still sound Shakespearean because we maintain the iambic pentameter form and we don't use modern jargon. These translations are intended for live performance. If you want to gain a deeper understanding of what modern English translation of Shakespeare is all about, the best place to go is Kent Richmond's website, fullmeasurepress.com. He built this site years ago to explain exactly how this kind of translation works, and you can read about the statistical analyses he's carried out to demonstrate that his translations don't dumb down or simplify the author's language. He has a page for each of his 8 books where you can read sample passages. It has links to his Amazon page where you can buy an edition, and he has a number of very interesting essays explaining this craft. This is the place to go, fullmeasurepress.com. Here is my sales page at teacherspayteachers.com, where you can purchase a license for individual use or for the classroom. There are some pop-up samples, and if you hit this preview button, you can download the first act and check out the interactivity of the links. I don't make much money doing this, but I'm proud to say that I was only the second person to ever do this specialized type of translation professionally. And I'm proud to say that I helped to pioneer this craft years before the HITS Foundation decided to sponsor an identical effort at Oregon Shakespeare Festival. Here's a summary of publication dates, translation scorecard. This list shows every person who has completed a modern English Shakespeare translation as of September 2015. To the best of my knowledge, that's it, just 4 people. Cavender and McLaughlin are both playwrights who have had original works produced at Oregon Shakespeare Festival. They were both commissioned by OSF to do modern English translations as pilot projects somewhat before the large-scale play-on effort was started. And that's why they're on this list. Mr. Richmond publishes under the trademark Enjoy Shakespeare, and I publish under the trademark Shakespeare 9010. To date, Mr. Richmond has completed and published 8 translations: King Lear, Twelfth Night, Romeo and Juliet, Much Ado About Nothing, Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Hamlet, and The Tempest. I've completed and published Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet. Kenneth Cavender has translated but not published Timon of Athens. Ellen McLaughlin has translated but not published Pericles, Prince of Tyre. You'll notice that Cavender and McLaughlin did 2 of Shakespeare's very worst plays, ones which are rarely produced. They purposefully chose horrible plays that almost no one has heard of because they didn't want to upset the Shakespeare establishment by experimenting with titles that people actually care about. Mr. Richmond and I started with Shakespeare's greatest plays, because we're not wimps. The translations of Timon and Pericles have both been fully produced and staged at major American theaters. The translations of Richmond and myself have not received so much as a reading in a bar. Here again is that May 2017 email which I received from a trust manager at Oregon Cultural Trust, outlining the civil rights laws which OSF is required to follow. I wanted to know why Oregon Shakespeare was being allowed to violate the laws listed here. The person I needed to talk to was this trust manager's boss, Brian Rogers. He's the executive director of the Oregon Arts Commission and Oregon Cultural Trust. For 4 months, he kept returning my calls at just the times when I said I would not be available, in the afternoon and evening of certain days, because that's when I would be at work. When I finally got Brian Rogers on the phone, it was immediately obvious that he didn't care in the slightest about this complaint. In fact, he was nearly catatonic. He came to the phone fully prepared to say nothing that would even remotely indicate the possibility that Oregon Shakespeare was violating its legal agreement with the Cultural Trust. He was completely unresponsive to my questions and comments. I asked him, how is this set up at Oregon Shakespeare not bigotry? After a few seconds of dead silence, I had to say, hello, are you still there? And he pipes up and says, oh, I'm sorry, was that a question? For 10 minutes, that was the conversation. I talked and he said absolutely nothing. In the end, Brian Rogers suggested, maybe your lawyer should get in touch with our legal department to discuss this issue, as though I have a lawyer, as though I have money to spend on a lawyer because the director of the Oregon Arts Commission refuses to do his job. What a prick. Oregon Shakespeare Festival has chosen their words very carefully to make it seem as though their hiring plan is entirely positive and good. How can there be a problem when their language is so wonderfully inclusive? More than half this and more than half that. It's called virtue signaling. This sort of thing is very common these days, and far too many people are fooled by it. I've prepared a second grid to make it perfectly clear that there's nothing virtuous about the Oregon Shakespeare Formula, even though it has been fully endorsed by Oregon Cultural Trust and apparently also by the Oregon State Legislature. Let's suppose that instead of Oregon Shakespeare Festival, there were a different Shakespeare Festival just down the road from OSF, right there in Ashland. They have a slightly different plan for hiring translators, but they're going to use the exact same formula used by OSF. Here's how they do it. Just like Oregon Shakespeare, they need 36 translators. However, this organization is run by white racists and sexist male pigs, so they're going to specify that more than half of their writers shall be white people, and more than half shall be men. Right away they've hit a snag because 12 of their white people are female and only 7 are male. They'll have to choose a dozen more males, but this time the translators don't all have to be white. All that matters is that they have penises instead of vaginas. So look, they have a few seats left over for women of color. That's fair, right? They picked these 5 ladies. Now, maybe there's a few other non-white females who really wanted to do modern English translations of Shakespeare. There might even be 1 or 2 of these rejects who have completed and published translations. Well, that's just too damn bad. Oregon Shakespeare Festival was perfectly consistent and methodical with the Oregon Exclusion Formula, and so was this outfit. Now, can anyone in the Oregon State Legislature explain to me why one of these is acceptable, but the other is not? If Oregon Cultural Trust approves of one, you have no choice but to approve the allocation of public funds to the other. I need to emphasize just how fundamentally absurd it is to even consider the race or gender of a translator. When a translator does their job competently, there should be no trace of that person's physical description in the work. If a Frenchman reads a French translation of a Harry Potter novel, at no point should it occur to them that this translator seems to be a Cuban-American man or a tall woman with red hair. The only culture and personas that matter are those in the fictional universe, with its magic and wizards. The morphological details of the translator must be utterly absent. Consider the plays of Anton Chekhov. Over the years, there have been numerous translations of The Seagull and Uncle Vanya. Because the Russian language has words without English equivalents, there are idiomatic expressions that make no sense in a word-for-word translation, and apparently there's a sense of humor in Chekhov which fluent speakers of Russian find very elusive. When you compare several translations of The Cherry Orchard side by side, you'll see enormous differences in the way those words appear on the page, because these were widely differing interpretations of words and phrases. But those choices are entirely the product of the mind. Skin color and sex organs contribute nothing to the effort. What if a mestizo woman begins a translation of Macbeth by saying to herself, "I think I can bring a new perspective to this play because I'm a mestizo woman with mixed Spanish and Aztec ancestry. I'll examine Macbeth through the lens of female mestizo experience." What exactly would that look like? My translation choices are my own, as are Mr. Richmond's. But what are the translation choices of a mestizo woman? I have no idea, and neither does she. I would argue that this person is not a translator at all. She's a fool. The audience doesn't care about her gender perspective or her ethnic experience. Anyone who inserts their personal identity into a translation is a failure as a translator. So make no mistake, I am not arguing that I and Mr. Richmond should have been given 2 of the several seats left over for white males. Of course not. All of those color-coded and gender-coded boxes are beyond ridiculous. People should have been brought into this program for only two reasons: proven merit and a desire to do the job well. This is a system which should have been rejected by every single person chosen. Every one of these people should have been insulted to the core once they realized that they had been chosen to fulfill a race quota or a sex quota rather than due to their own competence. No one with an ounce of dignity, with an ounce of confidence in their own abilities, should want to be brought into a translation project as a Latina, or as a black, or as an Asian, or a woman, or as a vegetarian, or Democrat, or Republican. Every last one of these people should have told Oregon Shakespeare Festival and the HITS Foundation to take their money and shove it. Every person should have told OSF that they have zero interest in the Play On project until their unjust bigotry scheme is eradicated. But they didn't, because they're all gutless. It's very easy to be a self-centered, self-righteous, social justice coward these days. At this point, there can't be any doubt as to why Mr. Richmond and myself were excluded, censored, from Oregon Shakespeare's Play On project. They simply couldn't stomach the thought of admitting that this artistic endeavor had been pioneered by two white males. It would have destroyed their social justice credentials to publicly acknowledge that two white males created and published groundbreaking translations of their own volition. The so-called liberals of academia have been at war with this mythic enemy called white male for several decades now, even though it's always been obvious that this category is a complete fiction. Listen to a classical music station for a day, and you'll hear music written across 5 centuries, from places all over the globe, music written by people from widely differing cultures and ethnicities. Yet all this output is crushed into that racist category called white male. All of that individual creativity is dismissed with the racist epithet, white male. The same is true of our common heritage in other arts: writing, painting, sculpture, architecture. This heritage is no longer the product of talented individuals. It's all just white males. So to all of you who I addressed as white male a few minutes ago, I apologize. You're just a guy. I'm convinced that if an African-American man had produced 8 modern English iambic pentameter translations of Shakespeare plays, as did Mr. Richmond, they would have been placed front and center when Play On was announced in 2015. If a woman of any ethnicity had produced 2 translations with extensively researched supplementary material, as I did, her work would have been proudly showcased from the start. Just imagine what would have transpired if that black man and that woman had been excluded purely out of spite. The condemnations would have been instantaneous. There would have been a tidal wave of rebuke accusing OSF, quite rightly, of racism and sexism. The people responsible would have been quickly fired. The scandal would have exploded across the internet and into the mainstream press, and the Oregon State Legislature would not have hesitated to cut off funding to the organization. You would have demanded major organizational changes before another dollar went from Oregon taxpayers to the theater. The entire nation would have heard about the immediate termination of all those salaried employees responsible for that bigoted hiring policy. But when I told my story to the New York Times, nothing happened. When I told my story to Willamette Week, nothing happened. The Oregon State Legislature is my last hope for getting anywhere with this problem. You might be wondering why I don't submit my Shakespeare translations to another theater. I already have. In the summer of 2014, I sent manila envelopes to 91 Shakespeare performing companies across America, every one that I could locate online. Some were large, like OSF, and some were tiny outfits that might not even exist anymore. None had the slightest interest in working with a translation because Shakespeare has a kind of sacred aura, and devotees get pretty fanatical about touching a single word. It's taken several $1 million from the Hits Foundation to break through that aura and make the performance of modern English Shakespeare possible. So this is it. The Oregon Shakespeare Festival is the only place in the United States where this is being done. I have nowhere else to go. Still, you might be thinking, well, 5 years ago there was no program available to you, so you're exactly where you were. No one's taken anything away from you. Well, what if the city of Ashland built a new city park and put up a sign that said, "No Chinese"? Chinese people would protest. A lot of people would protest. And the city council would say, well, 5 years ago, you Chinamen didn't have a city park, and you don't have one now. No one's taken anything away from you. No, that's not going to happen for two reasons. A city park is owned by the government, and that means that all sorts of civil rights laws are in force without debate. Second, even if it were a privately owned park, that's just not the sort of thing we do in the United States. Not anymore. Unless you're Louis Douthit. Douthit is the director of the Play On project. She created and implemented the bigoted formula which excluded me and Mr. Richmond. For many years, she has held major positions at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and she's beloved all around. She has promoted the theater arts with great enthusiasm and has inspired countless people. When you ask her why she did this horrible thing, I'm pretty sure she will insist it had nothing at all to do with her race and gender formula. She'll tell you the same thing she told me. Play On was only interested in hiring dramatists. A dramatist is a playwright. Kent Richmond and I have never written a play, therefore we aren't qualified to translate a play. That's what she'll say. The notion that a translator of a play needs to be a playwright is patently ridiculous. You don't have to be a novelist to translate a novel, or a film director to produce subtitles. But Douthit will insist that modern English translation of Shakespeare absolutely needs playwrights, for some reason. But if you check the list of people commissioned to do a translation, you'll discover that more than a few of them have never written a play. It's a lame excuse, but it's good enough for an out-of-control social justice warrior who wields power and is accountable to no one. I very much looked forward to being a part of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival's translation project, along with my colleague Kent Richmond. I expected that our works would be endorsed and promoted as flagship examples of this new translation style. Since we had both translated Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet, I looked forward to staged readings of excerpts, which contrast the differences in our approach to translation. I was certain that there would be links at the OSF website going straight to our resources. Mr. Richmond's paperback books should be on sale right now in their gift shop. Let me read you something very interesting. Here's a testimonial on the back of Mr. Richmond's Romeo and Juliet. Too often, unless we read a Shakespeare play beforehand, we process the language as if it were coming from a poorly tuned-in radio station. Shakespeare didn't write his plays to be experienced impressionistically as poetry. He assumed his language was readily comprehensible. At what point does a stage of language become so different from the modern one as to make translation necessary? Mr. Richmond is brave enough to assert that, for Shakespeare, that time has come. The French have Molière, the Russians have Chekhov, and now we can truly say that we have our Shakespeare. That testimonial is by John McWhorter, somebody who I'd call the Carl Sagan of linguistics. He's written many highly readable books on the subject. He's published major research. He has taught at Cornell and at the University of California at Berkeley. He's currently a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and is the host of Slate's podcast all about language called Lexicon Valley. In 1998, McWhorter published this book, Word on the Street, which contains a lengthy essay promoting the concept of updating Shakespeare's language. It was this essay which inspired Kent Richmond to undertake the task of making Shakespeare more comprehensible. As I was completing my Macbeth translation, I also discovered this essay, and I was stunned to find that a world-class linguist had outlined the very thing that I was already doing. So I sent him my work. And when Play On was announced, here's what happened. John McWhorter published a piece for the Wall Street Journal defending the project over the objection of many other academics. As soon as the Play On project was announced, it was condemned by true Shakespeareans everywhere. Professor McWhorter was the most authoritative voice to step forward and explain the absolute necessity of such an effort. He demonstrates the severity of the problem by giving some thorny examples from Hamlet and King Lear. He quotes a passage from Macbeth and asks the reader if they really know what this means. Then he mentions me. Here is that same brief passage as rendered by a teacher named Conrad Spoke. Now, I'm not actually a teacher. I guess he assumed I am since I published at that website called Teachers Pay Teachers. Actually, I work in a factory. He then gives my translated lines and defends my word choices. This was very gratifying for me, very nice to see my work appreciated by someone who really understands the craft. He has also discussed my work with a skeptical guest on his Lexicon Valley podcast. And yet, despite being quoted and sanctioned by one of America's most important linguists, I'm not good enough for Oregon Shakespeare Festival. McWhorter provided a glowing testimonial to Kent Richmond's published books, but he isn't good enough either. I wanted to be a part of this community. I planned on moving down to Oregon, but instead of inviting me to join, they erased me. They made me a non-person. They made Kent Richmond a non-person. As far as the theater world is concerned, we simply don't exist. I don't believe this kind of thing is supposed to happen in a democracy. The problem for you, an Oregon State Legislator, is to decide whether or not Oregon Shakespeare Festival is in violation of Oregon state law and what should be done about it. As a receiver of Oregon taxpayer funds, they signed an agreement to abide by state and federal non-discrimination laws. It seems to me that they have violated this agreement horribly and that their state funding should be cut off completely until big changes are made. To start the process of change, a few big questions need to be asked. Who is responsible for creating the Oregon Exclusion Formula? Was this bigotry ever challenged by OSF leadership? Is there a culture of selective exclusion at OSF? Has OSF targeted any other groups for exclusion? Have other OSF projects used illegal hiring criteria? Has OSF used any other clever strategies to exclude qualified people? I hope I've made it clear that my own whiteness or maleness is not the issue here. The fact is, at no point in my adult life have I ever identified as white. Racial identity is a psychological trick, a divisive illusion. In the 21st century, we should be eradicating artificial race categories, not perpetuating them. What Oregon Shakespeare has done is far more than just a mistake. It's evil. Oregon Shakespeare's immoral and illegal policies are part of a greater cancer in America. It's the cancer of bizarrely misguided people pretending to fight the bigotry of past generations with new bigotries of their own invention. I don't care if you're a Democrat, a Republican, or independent. It's important for you to act, to respond. If the Oregon State Legislature doesn't do something about this insanity in your part of the world, who will? Thank you very much for your time.